go ahead.
Okay, well, again, we get spotlighted. So we have a real treat tonight. Many of you already know the speaker personally. He's a magician, master carver, jack of all trades, and extremely knowledgeable about carousels, band organs. He's carved the facade for Glenn Thomas's 165. And as we're going to go pass it back to Bob Yorburg.
Thank you. Great introduction. Yeah. So here we go. Oopsie. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, no?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. All righty. So tonight's talk is about the Coney Island immigrant carvers, most of whom were from Eastern Europe and were Jewish, but they were from other places as well. And I'm going to give you a tour through quite a journey. It's really fun. So anyway, let's start. We're going to start with the history of carousels. Can I get rid of this? Is there a way to make this not show up? Can you see that? Anyway, so the carousels, pardon?
We can see the pointer. Or the
Oh, all right. Okay, great. And all you see is the screen. You don't see the stuff at the bottom of the screen that I'm seeing?
Exactly.
Excellent. All right. So carousels are also called roundabouts, gallopers, whirligigs, merry-go-rounds, carousels, and derby horses in England, of course. Our carousels go one way and the British carousels go in the reverse direction, which is logical because they even drive on the wrong side. So apologies to our British friends who are here tonight. Nonetheless, the name carousel is derived from an exercise in horsemanship. Basically, it was a show, an exhibition where they would parade the horses that were dressed very beautifully, as well as the riders, and perform ceremonial war type activities. The brass ring was born years ago as a training exercise. The folks with their lances would spear a ring that was being held, hung by a ribbon from a pole. By the way, you'll notice the horses have beautiful trappings. Hence, the carousel horses are mimicking that style of dress. Here you, pardon? Here you can see they're taking the lance and spearing the ring, hanging off the ribbon. And this was powered, the carousel was pushed by humans. So it wasn't, you can see the human in the pit here. So that was historically how they worked. Once again, here's the lance spearing the ring. So it's a tradition that goes way back. Here's swords spearing the ring. You can see the ring in the back here. I don't know how clearly, it's not that clear, but you can certainly see what's going on. Wonderful photo in France from the 1930s, once again spearing the ring. So this is where the catching the brass ring came from. Wonderful photo. The expression on the kids' faces is delightful. And you know, also, by the way, these carousels, you'll notice, didn't have platforms. So as the horses swung around, they kind of flew out a bit. And it's kind of neat, not as safe as ones with carousels. Here we are in Carousels. Carousels is one of the few amusement parks in the country that still has the brass ring. You can catch the brass ring. If you get the brass ring, it's a free ride. If you get a silver ring, it's not. And then at the end, you can throw the rings into a pit, which is a lot of fun. In the golden age of carousels, which was about the 1890s to 1920s, there were about 2,000 or 3,000 hand-carved carousels that were operating in this country, and now there's only about 150 to 200 left. Most of them, of course, were broken up and collectors grabbed the horses. And Coney Island, of course, was considered the epicenter of carousel manufacturing in the world. Now, the other thing is, Coney Island also had something called the Coney Island style, which was more flamboyant than any of the other carving styles in the country. And I believe the reason for that was the carvers were competing with each other for ridership, attention, sales, etc. You know, all of this came from Europe originally. Youngsters would be trained as apprentices, and they'd work with master carvers to become furniture carvers, architectural carvers, and in some cases, amusement carvers. When the apprentices became skilled enough, they became journeymen, and they literally journeyed to another city, in that there was only enough room in each town for one master. That can be debated, but nonetheless, it's pretty interesting. As such, the skills were and the designs were spread worldwide. If you look at some of the features which you're about to see, you can see them in North America, South America, Europe, all over. Some of the same designs and what have you. So going back to Eastern Europe, you can see that this is from the 1700s. The synagogues had the eagles, the lions, a lot of the things that you'll find in the menagerie carousels in this country, because a lot of the folks who carved the carousels came from this area. And here's the lions, which you'll see again later coming up, and of course the Pegasus, the birds, all of which appears in the American carousels. We're going to start with Marcus Charles ILLIONS, who was an extraordinary carver and based in Coney Island. He was born in Lithuania. Now, I'm going to preface all of this by saying, if you look at different sources, you'll get different information. So I've done, if you will, a best of, or what I think is most accurate. A lot of this is to be debated. For example, when he was born, where he came from. This is true of all of them, that some of the history is not agreed upon by various authors or historians. So ILLIONS carved circus wagons in Lithuania. His family was horse dealers, hence he learned the muscular anatomy of the horses. And because of the oncoming or imminent war, the Jews were persecuted, and he left at age 9 to go to Germany to apprentice as a wood carver, therefore avoiding the Russian army. He worked with Spooner. Spooner was a famous ride builder, very elaborately carved rides, and his preeminent client was Frederick Savage. Savage manufactured steam-powered agricultural equipment, and as such applied the steam power to carousels. And you can see that the steam plant was at the center of the carousel. And originally, the carousels might have been turned by either people with a crank or by horses or what have you. And we're now moving into yet another realm of carousel propulsion. This is obviously before electricity. Spooner shipped some unfinished circus wagons to America because they were behind schedule. And ILLIONS, as an apprentice, was expendable and therefore was shipped with the carvings to finish them on board. Raul may have some comments about that to boot. Nonetheless, the wagons came to Coney Island, and Bostock, who was a famous animal exhibitor from England, had the wagons on display. Bostock would have, a lot of exotic animals. Now, remember, this is before zoos, and so as such, when you would go to an exhibition, you would see trained animals, you would see animal shows, you would see perhaps a sacred cow, etc. We're moving on to ILLIONS started to carve for Louvre, and we're going to talk about Louvre in a moment. You'll see what his claim to fame was, or claims to fame. And ILLIONS created the carousel for Feltman's Carousel in Coney Island. Feltman, you may or may not know, was a huge restaurant and beer garden. Feltman is where Jimmy Durante got his start as a piano player in the beer garden. And the Feltman Carousel was very elaborate, it was quite extraordinary. And I'm going to show you some details coming up in a moment about what makes it so special. Oddly enough, a lot of the folks answered an ad. William F. Mangles, who was a famous ride inventor, He was featured in the 1914 Scientific American magazine, showing some of his ride designs because they were very clever and very original. Some of Mangel's rides still exist. For example, Ride Playland has a kiddie whip and an adult whip, as do other amusement parks around the country. Stein, Goldstein, Illions, etc. They all met at Mangel's and became friends. And you'll see how they interacted later on. There's more to come, and you'll see how that works. It's very interesting. And by the way, I believe Lisa Mangels Schaefer, the great granddaughter of Mangels, is on this presentation tonight. So at the end, when we have a Q&A, you may want to ask her about poking around the shop as a child, which was fascinating. Nonetheless, Mangels invented, as you know, the whip. The lower right-hand corner is Fatty Arbuckle riding the whip. Here's the witching waves, which were steel plates with finger joints and rollers underneath that would make the waves move. And these little wicker carts would be pushed along. And they needed all these folks to guide the carts because it was a little iffy. Whereas the top was quite something. And I may have a picture of it at night. No, I don't. Nonetheless, it was quite extraordinary. Coney Island at night was really delightful. It was, called the City of Lights, and people would actually go pay money to see the electric plants where they made all the lights. As such, ILLIONS carousel company grew, and I'm a little fascinated and surprised that he put in the center surround of the carousel a Jewish star. In light of the fact that there was a lot of, it wasn't easy being Jewish in those days in this area. Anyway, all of his children were active in the carousel business. They moved on to do other things, but it was fascinating that he employed each of them. Here he is in Coney Island, outside his shop, and he's riding his favorite horse, none other than Bob. And you can see it was quite a stallion. He was known for very flamboyant carving, the fiery manes, everything being gilded. Clearly, this was to attract ridership. You don't see any other carvers who did anything like this. It was really quite something. The little lattice work, the peekaboo lattice work, is very detailed and quite extraordinary. So he did some really extraordinary work. Legend has it that he carved all the heads and the expressions himself, whereas the apprentice carved the rest of the horse. You can see the expressions on these horses is just fantastic. And here you go, shows you more examples of the same. In the early 1900s, there was as many as 10 ILLIONS carousels operated at Coney Island, which is quite extraordinary. And there is a difference between ILLIONS company and some of the others, and I will show you that as we go on. New York Times referred to them as the Michelangelo of carousel carvers, which is, I think, interesting because he did certainly have a flair. Here's a bobtail, which is rather rare. And he produced his last carousel in 27. And apparently, by the way, this is a horsehair tail, which you don't see very often. Most of them are carved. But the Great Depression did impact the amusement industry rather severely. And as such, the carousel industry did not do well after that. I would like to show you this, which I think is extraordinary. This is the detail on the saddle blanket is really incredible. I believe I have a close-up of that. You can see how he did it all. And you can see the jewels and the variegated leaf and the gold leaf and the silver leaf and what have you. And even the cantle on the back is really quite something. I heard that the Feltman Carousel would light up at night to attract riders. And indeed, you can see the panel here on the side of the horse. Here's the door that opens up, and inside is the lights. And they did this, or I believe Borelli did this, to once again attract riders. And you can see in the next slide that the lights indeed, the jewels, glow. And I'm positive that this would attract ridership in the evening. Remember, carousels in those days probably attracted adults more so than children. So it was quite something to do that. That's the only version that I know of where anyone tried to light up horses from the inside. Apparently it wasn't so simple, but I think it looks rather effective in those photos. Here's an organ facade carved around 1925, heavily Baroque style. It's really quite something. And you'll also notice that curved to fit on the inside of the carousel. So the drums are on either side, pointing towards the carousel. The pipes would be right here in the center. Really something. Anyway, we're going to move on, and I'll show you some of the chariot sides that he did. The acanthus carving was really quite something. Here's a close-up of a similar side, restored, obviously. The lion is interesting in that it's a pose which is immediately recognizable. If you look at the pose on the decalogues from the synagogues, which Illion also carved, they're very similar. And also going back to the original carvings that I showed you from the 1700s, you can see where the inspiration came from. As such, you can see the decalogues in situ here in the synagogues in Brooklyn. They are still available and to see, and Illion's carved quite a number of them. If you look carefully, you'll see the very same decalogue in the back of the carving shop, the carousel carving shop. So you can see that they did both architectural carvings and horse carvings. And the interesting thing here is you can see a horse that has been bandsawed out, a horse that's roughed out, a horse that's carved even further, and the various stages of productions. Here's Illion's, Marcus Illion's himself, his son Rudy, and Philip right here, as well as another worker. This is clearly pre-OSHA. You'll notice that the bandsaw absolutely has no guards whatsoever, which I find kind of fascinating. He married his Russian bride at 17, I'm sorry. They had 4 children. All of whom became professionals. Barney Illions did paint carousel animals and has talked as recently as I believe the 70s, giving information about the wonderful golden age of carousels. Great Depression, of course, didn't help the carousel industry. And although he stayed busy repairing carousels, Illions reputedly died broke at age 78 in 1949. So we push on to Stein and Goldstein, both of whom met each other at Mangel's workshop. They both immigrated to this country rather in a similar time frame. They also both spoke Yiddish. As such, they may have befriended each other. One was a Stein, a carver of ladies' combs. And what that implies is not a comb like you comb your hair with, but a comb that you'd insert into your hair and there'd be a carving sticking up above it. Some of them were very intricate and very, very fine. He also carved for Louvre, but I'll go into that later when we talk about Louvre. Goldstein, on the other hand, was a pattern maker. Pattern makers made the models that would be inserted into the sand to mold and cast pieces for machineries and what have you. Pattern maker is the top of the line carver. So they were both incredibly talented. And as such, they started a company together in Brooklyn. The company moved quite a number of times. Ultimately, the last move was to a trolley barn, which apparently was huge from what I understand. And they built a lot of carousels there. By the way, they built some of the largest carousels ever made. Yorburg, by the way, was a partner at one point. He did the mechanisms. And you can see they changed the name of the company a couple of times. Here's the artistic carousel manufacturing company, Stein Goldstein. They too claim to have carved all of the heads of the horses themselves, while the others carved the bodies. And they provided carvings to other carousel companies. And you'll see that later on, who worked with whom. And nonetheless, there was a lot of crossover. A lot of folks carved for each other. I suspect when there was a nasty deadline and you needed to get a bunch of horses done, you may have gone to your competitors and said, "Do you have any horses?" And they bought from each other. They produced literally some of the biggest carousels in that they were not only huge in diameter, but the horses were bigger than most other carousel companies had ever produced. One was 60 feet across, 6 rows of horses, which would accommodate over 100 people. So that's an enormous piece. To me, a lot of what they carved look a little bit like caricatures in that they had, big teeth, large heads, and everything was exaggerated. The buckles, the belts, the huge buckles, but they were very expressive to boot. The manes would flow. The faces had wonderful expression. So I think they were very distinct in that regard. The armored horses were always a featured outside row piece because of all the detail, and they're very elaborate and enticing for folks. Here's one with ribbons and flowers and what they call cabbage roses, which are they're not flat. They're like, very ornate and wonderful. Here's one with an eagle and a banner on the back. No forelocks, you'll notice. All the mane was always whooshing back. Quite an extraordinary chariot side. Now, by the way, Stein Goldstein were the most successful of all of the carvers in their business because they retained ownership of the majority of their carousels. They owned 11 of the 17 carousels that they created. That saw them through the Great Depression, meaning if the business of carving carousels had dropped off, they were still collecting money, not only from the rides, but they had amusement parks where they would collect admission, food, concessions, all the rest of it. So that was quite something. Stein and Goldstein Carousel in Central Park is thankfully still restored and running with a real band organ, and it's quite something to see. If you have a chance, you should go look at it. There's also a Stein Goldstein in Hartford, in Bushnell Park, and it recently had its 100th birthday, and it too is worth seeing. If you have any questions about Stein and Goldstein, you can certainly ask at the end, but we're going to move on to, oh, by the way, I'm sorry. In the 20s, after everything was beginning to wane, they carved horses for barbershops. I don't know, some of you have probably seen these. This was for kids because kids oftentimes really didn't want their hair cut, and as such, sitting on a horse was a treat, and it was more likely that they were going to be attentive. So there you go. Charles Carmel, once again, they all met at William F. Mangel's shop, and Carmel was an extraordinary versatile carver. He was born in Russia in 1865, that is, trained as a carver there, and he arrived in America at 1883, age 18. Once again, in Coney Island, you can see the extraordinary detail that he had, as well as the expressive faces. He carved with ILLIONS, Stein and Goldstein, and at Mangel's shop. He also carved for Loof. He apparently could copy anyone's style and carve it with great panache. This obviously shows you the horse stripped down, and what's kind of intriguing is you can see they would use more or less whatever wood was available, and I think it's really fun to see the horses without paint and to see what they did in the way of piecing together available wood. Lovely detail here in the mane and the face. He moved his company to Rhode Island, opened his own shop, and he also, I'm sorry, Loof, who you'll see in a moment, moved to Rhode Island, hence Carmel opened his own shop in Prospect Park near the stables, and he got inspiration from there. And this gets interesting in a moment. He carved complete carousels for Mangel's, and you know that he worked for other companies, including PTC, Stein and Goldstein, and others. So In 1911, he built his own carousel for the famed Dreamland Park in Coney Island. He invested every penny in the project. It was to be the most extraordinary carousel ever. And on opening day, Dreamland was hit by a fire and there was nothing left. And as such, Carmel was financially ruined and he never truly recovered from that event, although he continued in business. He was known for his armored horses, fish scale blankets, incredible muscular bodies, and you can see the detail on the mane and the face is really quite something. He did stylize horses with the lolling tongue. There's a rumor, don't know if it's true, the tongue was sticking out if he was having trouble getting paid. That may or may not be the case. But you can see he had buckles and straps and really fun things. Deep relief flowers, once again, the cabbage roses, delightful poses. This is, they say that riding a Carmel is the same as joining the ranks of privilege. You can see this was quite something extraordinary with the lion on the back, the horn, the armored features, as well as the blankets, really something. This is a carving for Loof with a peekaboo mane, and he carved horses for other folks' showrooms because his carvings were so delightful. Here's one for the Mangles showroom. Here's one that, you know, Carmel did not like the use of jewels, but Borelli would get the horses and go to town putting, you know, gazillion jewels in there. I guess to intrigue and delight riders and to get more ridership. Not sure if it worked or not, but it's. I think it kind of kills the effect of the carving, but nonetheless, he enjoyed it. Carmel did other types of carousels, including realistic lions, wonderful whimsical sea creatures. The expression on the face is phenomenal. Here's the Carmel carousel that's at Knoebels Park. And by the way, we're having in 24 a band organ rally in Knoebels Park, and 26th is their 100th birthday. We will be there for that as well. So please join us for that. And by the way, Knoebels has 2 carved carousels, a carousel museum, 10 of their own band organs, absolutely worth a visit, a real steam train. Here's Rye Playland. Rye Playland was just recently restored, and it has a Gavioli organ in the center, phenomenal carousel, absolutely worth a visit. It is quite extraordinary. So Carmel's health began to deteriorate. He could only carve a few hours a day. He was suffering from arthritis and diabetes, and he died in 1931 at the age of 66. So we move on now to Charles I.D. Loof. Charles Loof was, in theory, a Danish carver, and actually he came from Germany, but Germany was under Danish control at that point. So when he moved here to the United States, they called him a Danish carver. Nonetheless, he was classically trained. And Loof was a master carver. He emigrated to US in 1870. Here's a horse in old paint, and it's an armored horse. You can see how extraordinary it is. He built over 40 carousels, which I think is kind of extraordinary. Several amusement parks and even roller coasters. So his amusement business was beyond just carousels, and it was apparently quite something. And he moved a number of times. We're going to go through that coming up. Here's, by the way, Loof's father was a blacksmith and a wagon builder. He learned his skills from him. This is a delightful horse, and you'll notice it's just returning from the hunt with some birds. So apparently the hunt was rather successful. The horses, I would say, at the turn of the 1900s, had stories to tell. They weren't as lighthearted and fanciful as some of them are now. There's a wonderful camel, and the expression on it is fabulous. It's obviously old paint once again, and I just think it's really quite something. Another camel, and look at the monkey on the back. I mean, there's a lot of detail in here that's just hiding away. Nonetheless, Loof also was avoiding the war. He emigrated to Brooklyn, became a furniture factory worker. He married Anna Dole from Germany. And by the way, lore has it that while he was carving in the furniture factory, he would take the scraps home and start carving carousel horses, and ultimately created his first carousel. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but it's a wonderful story. He then opened his first merry-go-round in 1876 in Coney Island, and that was Coney Island's first amusement ride. Here's a great giraffe, very unusual pose. It's a jumping giraffe, and a head incredibly expressive with acanthus leaves, coming off the head, and they are, I just think, fascinating because they're so unusual. Here's another jumper that's been restored. He had a factory in Brooklyn where he built carousels. He installed the carousel at Feltman's, which, as you know, is a restaurant and beer garden. And Feltman was credited with the invention of the hot dog, also known as the Coney Island Red Hot. For those of you who remember the history of Coney Island presentation that I did quite a while ago, there were some wonderful broadsides of the Feltman hot dogs marching in parade, telling the world where to find a hot dog. Here's a wonderful greyhound. The menagerie animals are not as common as the horses, and to look at some of the details on some of the other figures is delightful, including you can look at the musculature and the veins and the legs and what have you. As Loop's business expanded, he hired other carvers, John Zalar, Marcus ILLIONS, John Euler, Charles Carmel. So you can tell that the factory was growing by leaps and bounds if he was hiring that number and that quality of carvers. You can see the expression on the lion's face is really delightful. They had 6 children, all of whom worked in his carousel factory in one form or another, with the exception of Anna, who died at the age of 21 as a result of a trolley accident. Here's a Loof restored lion, and I'm sorry, tiger, I'll be all right. And here's a lovely teddy bear. Loof took over, well, actually New York City grabbed his property by eminent domain to build a park. So he then moved to Rhode Island, had quite a career there, and ultimately ended up in California, where he built carousels, games, designed the Byzantine Moorish style hippodrome at Santa Monica Pier. And if you recall, Barbara Foz Charles did a talk in which he showed us slides of that very same carousel and pier. That's the end. I now welcome questions from each of you. I'm sure you have many, and hope you enjoyed the brief history of the immigrant carvers of Coney Island. Thank you. Any questions?